You think you know Marshal Matt Dillon, the tall, calm lawman who kept the peace in Dodge City for 20 years. The hero who never flinched, never complained, never showed weakness. But what if everything you watched on your screen was just the surface? What if the man behind that badge was hiding secrets so deep, so painful, that even his closest friends never knew the full truth? Picture this. A 19-year-old kid steps off a landing craft onto the beaches of Anzio, Italy. 10 days later, he's lying in the sand, his leg torn apart by German machine gun fire, wondering if he'll ever walk again. Fast forward 11 years, and that same man is standing in front of millions of Americans, playing the strongest, most capable hero television has ever seen. But here's what nobody knew. Every single step he took was agony. Every ride on horseback sent pain shooting through his body. For 635 episodes, spanning 2 decades, James Arness never once let you see him suffer. And that's just one of the stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about this Hollywood legend. Let me take you back to May 26, 1923, Minneapolis, Minnesota. A baby boy enters the world, named James King Arness. Not Arness, Arness. His parents, Rolf and Ruth Arness, had no idea they'd just brought into the world a future television icon. But here's something most people don't know. 3 years later, they had another son. You might know him better as Peter Graves, the star of Mission Impossible. Yes, those 2 television legends who dominated different shows on different networks were actually brothers. But there's a twist to this story that's absolutely fascinating. While James kept a version of the family name, dropping just 1 letter to become Arness, his younger brother Peter took their mother's maiden name entirely, becoming Graves. Why? Some say Peter wanted to forge his own path without living in his older brother's shadow. Others suggest it was a practical decision to avoid confusion in Hollywood. But imagine being a television viewer in the 1960s and 1970s, watching Marshal Matt Dillon on CBS and Jim Phelps on ABC, having no idea these 2 commanding presences were actually brothers who grew up in the same house in Minneapolis. Growing up in Minnesota during the Great Depression wasn't easy for anyone, but the Arness boys had something special. They had each other, and they had dreams bigger than the cold winters that surrounded them. James was already tall as a teenager, unusually tall, and it set him apart in ways that weren't always comfortable. By the time he graduated from high school, he stood at an imposing 6 feet 7 inches. To put that in perspective, he was taller than almost everyone he ever met in his entire life. In fact, he was one of the tallest actors Hollywood has ever known. That height would later become his trademark, making him perfect for the role of a frontier lawman. But as a young man, it created an unexpected problem. When World War II broke out, and young James wanted to serve his country, he had his heart set on becoming a pilot. Can you imagine the irony? The man who would become famous for riding horses wanted to fly planes. But the military had strict regulations. Pilots couldn't be taller than 6 feet 2 inches. At 6'7", James Arness was 5 inches too tall to squeeze into a cockpit. So instead, he became a rifleman. This rejection probably saved his life in one way, but it also led him straight into one of the most horrific battles of the entire war. January 22, 1944. The Allied invasion of Anzio, Italy. Operation Shingle, they called it. James Arness, now going by the name Jim to his army buddies, was part of the 3rd Infantry Division. He was just 20 years old, tall and strong, carrying a rifle that felt like a toy in his massive hands. For 10 days, he fought alongside his brothers in arms, dodging bullets, surviving explosions, watching friends fall around him. And then, on the 10th day, everything changed in an instant. The sound came first, the distinctive chatter of German machine guns cutting through the air. Then came the impact. Multiple rounds tore into James Arness's right leg and foot, shattering bone, ripping through muscle, destroying nerves. He fell to the blood-soaked Italian sand, and in that moment, his life split into 2 parts, before Anzio and after Anzio. The medics got to him, thank God. They evacuated him off that beach, got him to a field hospital, and eventually shipped him back to the United States. He ended up at the 91st General Hospital in Clinton, Iowa, where he spent nearly a year undergoing surgery after surgery. Doctors worked frantically to save his leg. Some wanted to amputate. James refused. He was determined to keep his leg, no matter how damaged it was. The surgeries were partially successful, but the damage was permanent. His right leg would never fully heal. Part of his foot was essentially gone. The nerves were so damaged that he'd feel pain for the rest of his life. The Army honorably discharged him in January 1945, and they gave him medals, the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, recognition of his bravery and sacrifice. But medals don't take away pain. Medals don't help you walk without limping. Medals don't erase the trauma of watching your leg get destroyed by enemy fire when you're barely old enough to vote. So what do you do when you're 22 years old, standing 6'7", with a bum leg that'll hurt for the rest of your life, and you need to figure out how to make a living? James Arness went back to Minneapolis and took a job as a radio announcer at station WLL. But something inside him had changed during the war. Maybe it was facing death on that beach. Maybe it was the long, lonely hours recovering in that hospital. Whatever it was, James Arness developed a hunger to do something more with his life. He'd always been a quiet guy, introspective, not one to draw attention to himself despite his towering height. But now he had this burning desire to act, to perform, to tell stories. His friends thought he was crazy. "You're 6'7" with a limp, and you want to go to Hollywood?" they said. But James Arness had faced down German machine guns. A little skepticism from his friends wasn't going to stop him. So he did something that perfectly captures the determination of this man. He hitchhiked to California. That's right. One of Hollywood's future biggest stars literally stuck his thumb out on the side of the road and hitched rides all the way from Minnesota to Los Angeles, his damaged leg throbbing the entire journey. Hollywood in the late 1940s was brutal. For every success story, there were thousands of failures. Beautiful men and women who came to chase dreams and left broken and penniless. James Arness arrived with 3 strikes against him. He was too tall, he walked with a noticeable limp, and he had 0 professional acting experience. He made the rounds to casting offices and agencies, getting rejected over and over. Too tall, too stiff, too inexperienced. But then something happened that would change everything. He caught the attention of a casting director at RKO Pictures. They saw something in this giant of a man with the quiet intensity. They started giving him bit parts, tiny roles where his height actually worked in his favor. He appeared in several films in the early 1950s, usually in roles where his imposing physical presence made an impact even without many lines. And then came the role that would become a Hollywood legend, though not for the reasons you might think. In 1951, James Arness landed the title role in a science fiction film called The Thing from Another World. Now, before you get too excited, you need to understand what this role actually entailed. James Arness played an alien monster, a creature from outer space that terrorizes an Arctic research station. But here's the kicker. He spent the entire movie covered in a monster suit and heavy makeup. Nobody could even see his face. The thing was meant to be frightening, inhuman, and utterly alien. So why was this role important? Because director Howard Hawks and producer John Carpenter knew that to make the creature truly terrifying, they needed someone with an unusual physical presence. At 6'7", with broad shoulders and that subtle limp that made his movements slightly off-kilter, James Arness was perfect. He lumbered through that film like something that didn't quite belong on Earth, and even though audiences had no idea who was under that makeup, his performance helped make the film a classic of 1950s science fiction. It would be remade decades later by John Carpenter, but that 1951 original, with James Arness as the monster, remains a landmark of the genre. Still, despite this success, James Arness wasn't exactly a household name. He was getting steady work, but mostly in small supporting roles. He needed something bigger, something that would allow him to show what he could really do as an actor. That opportunity was about to arrive, but it would come through one of the most unlikely friendships in Hollywood history. Enter John Wayne. Yes, the John Wayne. The Duke himself. The biggest star in Hollywood. The man who defined what it meant to be a movie hero. By the early 1950s, John Wayne was not just an actor. He was an institution, a cultural force, a living symbol of American masculinity and strength. So how does a struggling actor like James Arness become friends with John Wayne? The answer lies in their work together. Wayne started casting Arness in supporting roles in several of his films: Big Jim McLean, Hondo, Island in the Sky, and The Sea Chase. On those sets, something remarkable happened. John Wayne, who could be famously difficult and demanding, took a genuine liking to this quiet giant who never complained, never caused drama, and always showed up ready to work despite the pain in his leg. They shared something deeper too. Both men were war veterans, though Wayne's service had been limited to morale-boosting tours. Wayne respected Arness's combat experience, and the wounds he carried. They'd sit together between takes, and Wayne would tell Arness about the film industry, about how to build a career, about the difference between being an actor and being a star. Their friendship would become one of the most important relationships in James Arness's life, and it was about to pay dividends in a way that nobody could have predicted. In 1955, CBS was developing a new television show. It would be a Western, based on a radio program that had been successful for several years. The show was called Gunsmoke, and it centered on Marshal Matt Dillon, the lawman of Dodge City, Kansas. This wasn't going to be your typical shoot-'em-up Western. The creators wanted something grittier, more realistic, more adult. They wanted a hero who used his brain as much as his gun, who understood that violence was sometimes necessary but never glorified it. They wanted an actor who could carry that weight, that authority, that gravitas. The network executives had one name at the top of their wish list: John Wayne. They offered Wayne the role of Matt Dillon, thinking his star power would guarantee the show's success. But Wayne turned them down flat. He was a movie star, not a television actor, and in 1955, those were very different things. Television was still seen as the lesser medium, something actors did when they couldn't make it in films. But here's what makes John Wayne truly remarkable. Instead of just saying no, he made a counter-proposal that changed television history. He told the executives, "I can't do it, but I know someone who can. James Arness." The executives were skeptical. Who the hell was James Arness? He'd played some monster in a sci-fi movie and had bit parts in a few westerns. Why would John Wayne recommend him? But Wayne was insistent. He saw something in Arness that others missed: a quiet strength, a natural authority, and an everyman quality that would make him believable as a frontier lawman. Wayne was so confident in his recommendation that he agreed to do something unprecedented. He would appear in the very first episode of Gunsmoke, not as an actor, but as himself, introducing James Arness to the American public and personally vouching for him. James Arness himself wasn't sure about the role. He'd been working steadily in films and was worried that television would be a step down, possibly a career killer. But John Wayne sat him down and explained the opportunity. "Jim," Wayne said, "television is the future. This show could run for years. You'd work steadily, build a following, and establish yourself in a way that supporting roles in movies never will. Trust me on this." So Arness said yes, and on September 10, 1955, Gunsmoke premiered on CBS. John Wayne appeared in the opening, standing in Western clothes against a sparse set, looking directly into the camera. "Good evening," he said in that distinctive Wayne drawl. "My name's Wayne. Some of you have seen me before. I hope so. I've been kicking around Hollywood a long time. I've made a lot of pictures out here, all kinds. Some of them have been Westerns, and that's what I'm here to tell you about tonight, a Western. A new television show called Gunsmoke. It's a story about violence, but violence that's part of the building of the American West, and it's handled honestly and realistically. I think it's the best thing of its kind that's come along. I'm glad to have had a hand in getting it on the air. And I'm especially glad to introduce the star, a young fellow who, I predict, is going to be a big attraction in the business. His name is James Arness." That endorsement from John Wayne was like gold. Suddenly, viewers who might have skipped a new Western gave Gunsmoke a chance, because if John Wayne said it was good, it must be good. And what they saw amazed them. James Arness wasn't flashy or theatrical. He played Matt Dillon with a quiet, measured strength that felt completely real. He was tall enough to be physically imposing, but he moved with a subtle caution that suggested a man who knew violence and respected its consequences. His voice was deep but never booming, authoritative but never arrogant. He made Matt Dillon feel like a real person, not a superhero. The limp that had been a liability in his film career actually added to his authenticity on television. This was a lawman who'd been through hard times, who carried old wounds, who understood that being a hero didn't mean being invincible. Critics loved the show. Audiences loved the show. And they especially loved James Arness. Within months, Gunsmoke was one of the highest-rated programs on television, and James Arness became one of the most recognizable faces in America. But here's what almost nobody knew, what James Arness never publicly discussed. Every single day of filming was an ordeal of pain. Remember that leg injury from Anzio? It never healed. The surgeries had saved his leg from amputation, but they hadn't restored it to health. The nerve damage meant he lived with chronic pain every single day. And Gunsmoke required him to do things that exacerbated that pain constantly. He had to ride horses for hours during filming. He had to stand for long takes. He had to walk, run, climb stairs, get into physical altercations during fight scenes. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his damaged leg. But James Arness never complained. He never asked for special treatment. He never let the cast and crew see him suffering. He'd show up early, do his work professionally, and push through the pain with a stoicism that would have made his army sergeant proud. Between takes, he might sit down and stretch that leg out, maybe close his eyes for a moment. But then he'd stand right back up and do another scene. Some of the cast members noticed that he sometimes walked differently from one week to the next, depending on how bad the pain was, but Arness would brush off their concerns with a joke or a change of subject. For 20 years, through 635 episodes, James Arness carried that secret pain, and the viewing public never had a clue that their invincible Marshal was suffering with every step. Let's talk about the romantic angle of the show, because this might be the most fascinating creative decision in television history. Marshal Matt Dillon had an obvious love interest, Miss Kitty Russell, the owner of the Long Branch Saloon, played brilliantly by Amanda Blake. The chemistry between Matt and Kitty was electric. They flirted, they bantered, they clearly cared deeply for each other. Viewers spent 20 years wondering when Matt Dillon would finally sweep Miss Kitty off her feet, kiss her, and ride off into the sunset together. But it never happened. Through 2 decades of television, Marshal Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty never kissed. Not once. Not even a peck on the cheek. This drove audiences crazy. Letters poured into CBS by the thousands. Let them kiss. Put them together. We need romance. But the show's creators and James Arness himself were adamant that Matt and Kitty should never consummate their relationship. Why? Years later, Arness explained the reasoning in an interview. He said, "If Matt and Kitty ever kissed, the whole thing would change. He'd stop being the Marshal, and she'd stop being the mystery. Our relationship was downplayed because we thought it was more titillating to leave matters to the viewer's imagination." It was a brilliant decision, actually. By never resolving the sexual tension between Matt and Kitty, the show kept that spark alive for its entire run. Viewers could project their own desires and interpretations onto that relationship, and the unspoken longing between the two characters became one of the show's defining characteristics. There was another layer to this decision too, one that James Arness admitted in private conversations. He felt that Matt Dillon, as the moral center of Dodge City, had to be somewhat lonely and isolated. Being a lawman in the Wild West meant making hard decisions that other people didn't understand. It meant being willing to kill when necessary to protect innocent people. That kind of burden doesn't allow for an easy domestic life. So Matt Dillon remained emotionally available, but never quite reachable, and that made him more interesting as a character. Now, here's something most viewers never realized. There was one woman that Matt Dillon kissed during the entire 20-year run of Gunsmoke, and it wasn't Miss Kitty. In an episode called Matt's Love Story, Marshal Dillon suffers a severe concussion that causes temporary memory loss. While recovering, he meets a woman played by Michael Learned, yes, the mother from the Waltons. And in his confused, vulnerable state, he falls in love with her. They kiss. It's tender, passionate, real. For the only time in the series, viewers got to see Matt Dillon as a man capable of romantic love, not just affectionate friendship. But then his memory returns, and he remembers who he is, Marshal Matt Dillon of Dodge City. The woman realizes he can never truly be hers, and she leaves town. Matt returns to his duties, to his unspoken relationship with Miss Kitty, to the loneliness that defines his life. It was a heartbreaking episode, and it proved exactly why the creators were right to keep Matt and Kitty apart. That one kiss, with that one woman, in that one episode, was precious precisely because it was rare. If Matt had been kissing Miss Kitty every week, it would have meant nothing. Behind the scenes, James Arness had his own complicated relationship with romance and family, and this is where his life gets truly tragic. In 1948, before he'd hitchhiked to Hollywood, before he'd become famous, James married a woman named Virginia Chapman. She was an actress and businesswoman, beautiful and ambitious in her own right. Together they had 3 children. Well, technically James adopted Virginia's son Craig from a previous relationship, and then they had 2 children together, Rolf and Jenny Lee. For a while, they seemed like the perfect Hollywood family. James was working steadily, Virginia was building her own career. The kids were healthy and happy. But fame changes things. Success changes things. As Gunsmoke, exploded in popularity, and James Arness became a massive television star. The pressures on their marriage intensified. James was working brutal hours, filming episode after episode, dealing with constant pain from his leg injury, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for his family. Virginia felt increasingly isolated from her husband's world. Their personalities, which had complemented each other when they were young and struggling, now seemed to clash. In 1960, after 12 years of marriage, James and Virginia divorced. The split was painful but civil, and James got legal custody of the children. But the real tragedy was still to come. Their daughter, Jenny Lee Arness, was a beautiful young woman who had dabbled in acting, even appearing in a few episodes of Gunsmoke and other television shows. She seemed to have everything ahead of her: youth, beauty, talent, and a famous father who loved her deeply. But Jenny was struggling with demons that nobody fully understood. On May 12, 1975, Jenny Lee Arness died of an apparent drug overdose in Malibu, California. She was only 24 years old. The official ruling was that her death was deliberate suicide. For James Arness, this was a wound that would never heal. He'd survived machine gun fire at Anzio. He'd overcome a devastating injury that should have ended his career before it started. He'd built one of the most successful television shows in history. But he couldn't save his daughter. The pain of losing Jenny Lee haunted James Arness for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about it publicly, maintaining the same stoic silence about his personal tragedies that he'd maintained about his physical pain. But those close to him knew that something had broken inside him the day Jenny died. And then, as if the universe hadn't taken enough from him, tragedy struck again. In July 1977, just 2 years after Jenny's death, Virginia Chapman, James's first wife and the mother of his children, also died of a drug overdose. The official ruling was accidental this time, but the pain was just as intense. James Arness had lost his daughter and his ex-wife within 2 years, both to drugs, both far too young. Some people would have crumbled under that weight. Some people would have turned to alcohol or pills themselves, let the grief consume them, given up. But James Arness kept working. He kept showing up to the set of Gunsmoke. He kept playing Marshal Matt Dillon with the same quiet strength and integrity that had defined the character for over 15 years by that point. Maybe the work was what saved him. Maybe pretending to be a strong, capable hero helped him survive when his real life was falling apart. Or maybe James Arness was just made of tougher stuff than most people, forged in the fires of war and hardened by decades of chronic pain, able to compartmentalize his grief and keep functioning when lesser men would have collapsed. In 1978, as he was processing the loss of Jenny and Virginia, James Arness met a woman named Janet Surtees. She wasn't an actress. She had no Hollywood ambitions. She worked in a clothing store and was a single mother trying to make a life for her son. They met through mutual friends, specifically through Glenn, a makeup artist who worked on Gunsmoke, and whose wife owned the store where Janet worked. Glenn kept telling James about this amazing woman he should meet. Janet was reluctant at first. She'd been hurt before, and she wasn't interested in getting involved with some famous actor who probably had women throwing themselves at him. But then her son got involved. You see, her son was a huge Gunsmoke fan. When he heard there was a chance his mom might meet Marshal Matt Dillon, he practically begged her to go on the date. So she agreed, more for her son than for herself. That first date changed everything. James Arness, who could command a television screen and dominate any room he walked into, was completely charming and down-to-earth with Janet. He didn't talk about his fame or his show. He asked about her life, her interests, her son. He was kind, attentive, genuine. Janet saw past the celebrity and recognized the lonely, wounded man underneath. James saw in Janet something he desperately needed: stability, kindness, someone who valued him for who he was rather than what he represented to millions of fans. They started dating seriously, and for the first time in years, James Arness felt something like peace in his personal life. Janet didn't care about Hollywood parties or red carpets. She valued quiet evenings, genuine conversation, and building a real life together. She also loved James's children, treating them with the same care and affection she showed her own son. In December 1978, James and Janet got married in a private ceremony, far from the media spotlight. This marriage would last for the rest of James's life. 33 years of genuine partnership, love, and mutual support. Janet gave James what he'd been missing for decades: a real home. She never sought the spotlight herself, content to be the woman behind the man, supporting him through the final years of Gunsmoke and all the projects that followed. When James was in pain from his leg, Janet was there. When he struggled with the memories of Jenny and Virginia, Janet was there. When he just needed to be Jim instead of James Arness, the television star, Janet was there. He would later call Janet the best part of my life. And those who knew them both said they'd never seen James as genuinely happy as he was with his second wife. Let's talk about money, because this is one of the most shocking parts of the James Arness story that nobody talks about. When Gunsmoke started in 1955, James was making about $1,200 per episode. That was decent money for a television actor in the 1950s, but nothing spectacular. However, as the show became a massive hit and ran year after year, James's salary increased dramatically. By the later seasons, he was earning $20,000 per episode. Over the course of the show's 20-year run, James Arness earned approximately $30 million from Gunsmoke alone. And remember, that's in 1970s dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to well over $150 million in today's money. But here's the truly mind-blowing part. James Arness earned more money from Gunsmoke than John Wayne earned from his entire film career. Yes, you read that correctly. The biggest movie star of his generation, the man who'd starred in countless westerns and war films and become an American icon, earned less over his lifetime than James Arness earned from one television show. Why? Because television provided steady, reliable income year after year, while movie actors, even stars like Wayne, were paid per picture with long gaps between projects. It's a testament to the financial power of television and also to the incredible longevity of Gunsmoke. Speaking of that longevity, let's put it in perspective. Gunsmoke premiered on September 10th, 1955, and aired its final episode on March 31st, 1975. 20 years. 635 episodes. For much of that time, it was the highest-rated show on television. It survived changes in management at CBS, shifts in American culture, competition from dozens of other westerns, and the general decline of the western genre in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Why did it last so long when so many other shows failed? A huge part of the answer is James Arness. He was the one constant throughout the entire run. Other cast members came and went. Dennis Weaver left and was replaced by Ken Curtis. Amanda Blake eventually departed. Milburn Stone dealt with health issues. But James Arness was there for every single episode. He never held out for more money. He never threatened to quit. He never became difficult or demanding. He showed up, did the work, and maintained the integrity of the character through 2 decades of changing television landscape. Producers knew they could count on him, and that reliability was invaluable. But don't mistake reliability for lack of talent. James Arness brought something special to Matt Dillon that made the character transcend typical television heroes. He played Matt as a man burdened by his responsibilities, someone who understood that wearing a badge meant carrying the weight of other people's safety on your shoulders. In lesser hands, Matt Dillon could have been a one-dimensional tough guy, quick with a gun and light on personality. But Arness gave him depth. You could see the thought process in his eyes before he made a decision. You could see the reluctance when he knew violence was the only solution to a problem. You could see the loneliness of being the man everyone depended on, but nobody could truly understand. And you could see the fundamental decency that made Matt Dillon more than just a lawman. He was a good man trying to do right in a harsh world that didn't always reward goodness. That complexity kept viewers coming back week after week, year after year. There's an interesting dynamic that developed between James Arness and the rest of the Gunsmoke cast over those 20 years. At first, some of the other actors, particularly Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams, were skeptical of Arness. Stone had been acting professionally since before James was born. And here comes this tall, quiet guy with limited experience getting the lead role essentially because John Wayne vouched for him. Stone thought Arness seemed distant, maybe even arrogant. But over time, as they worked together episode after episode, year after year, Stone came to recognize that Arness's quietness wasn't arrogance. It was a combination of natural introversion and the constant management of chronic pain. Stone watched Arness push through scenes that must have been agony for his damaged leg, never complaining, never asking for special treatment. He saw how Arness treated the crew with respect and gratitude. He noticed how Arness would give credit to his fellow actors and deflect praise from himself. Gradually, Stone's initial skepticism transformed into deep respect and genuine friendship. By the end of the series, Stone would say that working with James Arness was one of the great privileges of his career, and the two men remained close friends until Stone's death. The same pattern played out with other cast members. Amanda Blake initially thought Arness was aloof and hard to read, but she came to understand that his reserve was just his personality, and beneath that quiet exterior was a kind and generous spirit. Dennis Weaver, who played the lovable Deputy Chester Good for the first 9 seasons, always credited Arness with making him look good on screen, saying that Arness was so secure in his own role that he never felt threatened by other actors getting attention. Ken Curtis, who replaced Weaver as Deputy Festus Hagen, found Arness to be a mentor who helped him navigate the pressures of joining an established hit show. Even the guest stars who appeared for 1 or 2 episodes came away impressed by Arness's professionalism and warmth. In an industry known for massive egos and temperamental stars, James Arness was an anomaly, a leading man who didn't act like a leading man, who treated everyone with the same quiet courtesy, who checked his ego at the door every single day. When Gunsmoke finally ended in 1975, it wasn't because of declining ratings or network pressure. It was actually still performing respectably in the ratings, and CBS would have been happy to continue airing it. But James Arness was exhausted. 20 years of playing the same character, 20 years of physical demands that his injured body was increasingly struggling to meet, 20 years of being Marshal Matt Dillon. It was enough. He wanted to spend more time with Janet, maybe do some other projects, enjoy life a little. So he approached the network and producers and explained that he was ready to move on. They respected his decision, and Gunsmoke aired its final episode on March 31st, 1975. The end of that episode is worth noting because it perfectly encapsulates the show and the character. There's no dramatic shootout, no major life change, no neat resolution. Matt Dillon simply rides out of Dodge City one more time, the way he'd done countless times before, and the camera holds on him as he disappears into the distance. The message was clear. The story of Dodge City and Marshal Matt Dillon would continue. We're just not watching anymore. It was a perfect ending for a show that had always valued authenticity over melodrama. But here's what shocked both James Arness and the viewing public. Gunsmoke wasn't really over. The character of Matt Dillon was too beloved, too iconic, to simply disappear. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, CBS produced a series of Gunsmoke television movies, with James Arness reprising his role as Matt Dillon. These movies, Gunsmoke, Return to Dodge, Gunsmoke, The Last Apache, Gunsmoke, To the Last Man, Gunsmoke, The Long Ride, and Gunsmoke, One Man's Justice, were hugely successful, consistently winning their time slots and reminding viewers why they'd fallen in love with the character in the first place. For James Arness, these movies were a chance to visit an old friend, to put on that badge again for a few weeks and step back into the role that had defined his career. And remarkably, even though he was now in his 60s, even though his injured leg was causing him even more pain than it had decades earlier, Arness still played Matt Dillon with the same integrity and strength that had made the character a legend. There's a beautiful irony in James Arness's career. He became famous for playing a character of unwavering strength, a man who could face down any threat without flinching, a hero who never showed weakness. But the real James Arness was actually demonstrating a different kind of strength. The strength to endure chronic pain without complaint, the strength to push through unimaginable personal tragedies and keep working, the strength to remain humble and kind despite massive fame and fortune, the strength to maintain a 33-year marriage built on genuine love rather than Hollywood glamour. In many ways, the real James Arness was a far more impressive figure than Marshal Matt Dillon ever could have been, precisely because his strength wasn't fictional. It was earned through suffering, tested through loss, and maintained through sheer force of will. Let's talk about his relationship with his brother Peter Graves, because this is another fascinating aspect of James's life that deserves attention. Peter went on to become a huge star in his own right, first with Fury in the 1950s, then with Mission Impossible in the late 1960s and early 1970s. At the height of their careers, both Arness brothers were starring in iconic television shows, dominating the airwaves on different networks. But despite their parallel successes, they maintained a close relationship. Peter would later say that James was his hero, not just as an older brother, but as a man who'd overcome so much adversity to achieve success. The brothers got together regularly, away from the cameras and press, just two Minnesota kids who'd somehow both ended up as television stars, sharing stories and supporting each other through the ups and downs of Hollywood life. When James was going through the tragedies with Jenny and Virginia, Peter was there for him. When Peter faced his own challenges and pressures, James was there for him. They understood each other in a way that nobody else could, bound not just by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect. As James Arness moved into his later years, he largely retired from acting after the final Gunsmoke TV movie in 1994. He'd earned his rest. He'd given audiences 20 years of weekly episodes plus 5 TV movies, more than 600 hours of entertainment. He'd earned more money than he could ever spend. He'd found happiness with Janet. He'd survived wars both literal and metaphorical. Now he just wanted to enjoy his life away from the spotlight. He and Janet lived quietly in Brentwood, California, in a home that reflected their personalities, comfortable, unpretentious, warm. James filled his days with simple pleasures: reading, spending time with Janet, seeing his son Rolf and Rolf's family, following his beloved Minnesota sports teams. He stayed out of the tabloids, avoided the Hollywood party circuit, and guarded his privacy fiercely. In an age where celebrities will do anything for attention, James Arness simply disappeared into a peaceful retirement, and the media largely respected his desire for privacy. But the pain from that Anzio Beach in 1944 never left him. For over 60 years, James Arness lived with the consequences of those 10 days of combat. The damaged nerves in his right leg continued to cause him discomfort. As he aged, the pain actually got worse, compounded by arthritis and the general deterioration of a body that had been pushed to its limits for decades. James never complained publicly about it, maintaining the same stoicism in private life that he'd shown throughout his career. But those closest to him knew he was suffering. Janet would later recount how some mornings, Jim would need time to work up the courage to get out of bed because putting weight on that leg was so painful. Yet he'd still get up, still face the day, still maintain that quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. On June 3, 2011, James Arness died at his home in Brentwood from natural causes. He was 88 years old. When the news broke, tributes poured in from fellow actors, directors, producers, and millions of fans who'd grown up watching him as Marshal Matt Dillon. The Hollywood community was shocked by just how many people were genuinely grieving the loss of this man who'd spent the last 17 years out of the spotlight. It turned out that James Arness had touched far more lives than anyone realized. Fans who'd watched Gunsmoke as children and were now grandparents themselves mourned the passing of a hero who'd represented something pure and good in their youth. Fellow actors praised his professionalism and kindness. Veterans organizations honored him as a combat veteran who'd represented their generation with dignity. And television historians recognized him as one of the most important figures in the history of the medium, a man who'd helped prove that television could tell meaningful, lasting stories with the same impact as films. The funeral was private, attended only by close family and friends, exactly as James would have wanted. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a location that has never been publicly disclosed. A final act of privacy for a man who'd spent most of his life in the public eye, but always guarded his personal space. Janet Surtees, his wife of 33 years, released a brief statement thanking fans for their support and asking for privacy as she grieved. She never gave interviews about James's death, never wrote a tell-all book, never tried to capitalize on her connection to a television legend. She simply mourned her husband quietly, with the same dignity and privacy that had characterized their marriage. Looking back on James Arness's life from the perspective of today, certain things become clear. First, he was tougher than any character he ever played. Marshal Matt Dillon never had to deal with a shattered leg that caused pain every single day for over 60 years. Marshal Matt Dillon never had to bury a daughter and an ex-wife within 2 years of each other. Marshal Matt Dillon never had to prove himself in an industry that initially didn't want him because he was too tall and walked with a limp. James Arness did all of that and more, and he did it with grace, humility, and quiet strength. Second, he understood something that many actors never learn: that fame and success don't have to change who you are at your core. James Arness remained the quiet, unassuming Minnesota kid throughout his entire life, even when he was one of the biggest stars on television. He never developed an ego, never became demanding or difficult, never let success corrupt his essential decency. Third, He proved that you don't need to be flashy or theatrical to make a lasting impact. His performance as Matt Dillon was defined by subtlety and restraint, by what he didn't do as much as what he did, by the quiet authority he projected rather than any scenery-chewing dramatics. And yet, decades after Gunsmoke ended, people still remember Marshal Matt Dillon, still regard the show as one of the best westerns ever made, still point to James Arness as the gold standard for television heroes. But perhaps the most important legacy of James Arness has nothing to do with his acting career. It's about how he lived his life. He faced unimaginable pain, physical, emotional, psychological, and he kept going. He experienced losses that would have destroyed lesser people, and he survived. He achieved massive success and remained humble. He could have complained about his war injury, could have used it as an excuse, could have demanded special treatment, and people would have understood. But he never did. He just showed up and did the work day after day, year after year, episode after episode, living proof that true strength isn't about never feeling pain or fear or grief. It's about feeling all those things and continuing anyway. That's a lesson that transcends entertainment, that speaks to something fundamental about human resilience and dignity. In the end, what made James Arness remarkable wasn't that he was tall, or that he starred in the longest-running Western in television history, or that he earned millions of dollars. What made him remarkable was his character. Not the character he played, but the character he had. He was a good man who faced bad luck and worse tragedies and came through it all without becoming bitter or broken. He was a hero not because he played one on television, but because he embodied heroism in his real life. Courage in the face of pain, strength in the face of loss, kindness in the face of fame, humility in the face of success. Marshal Matt Dillon was fictional, but James Arness was real, and the real man was far more impressive than any character could ever be. That's the story that nobody believed until they looked deeper, until they learned about the machine guns at Anzio, and the chronic pain, and the lost daughter, and the quiet dignity, and the love story with Janet, and the friendship with John Wayne, and all the other details that reveal the truth about this remarkable man. James Arness wasn't just an actor who played a marshal. He was a war hero who became a television legend, a wounded warrior who never let his wounds define him, a grieving father who found reasons to keep living, a humble man who achieved extraordinary things, and ultimately, a reminder that real heroes exist not just in fiction but in the real world, walking among us, often suffering in silence, always pushing forward despite the pain. That's the legacy of James Arness, and it's a legacy worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth sharing with anyone who needs a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and the quietest people are often the strongest. Marshal Matt Dillon rode off into the sunset in 1975, but the man who played him continued his journey for another 36 years, teaching us through his example what it really means to be a hero. And that ultimately is a story that everyone should believe, because it's absolutely true.